Hey, I'm Jack Nato. I'm the president and co-founder of Lunar Technologies. We make automated hydrocarbon extraction equipment, and we're the only ones who do it.
Hi, I'm Devin Reed. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of Vape. Vape is the most advanced automated cartridge filler available anywhere in the world.
My name is Sean Duffy. I'm the CEO of Media Bros, and we provide premium CRC filter media to the cannabis market. As a supplier to the cannabis industry, we've really kind of recognized that the market space has changed, right? And the needs in that space now require us to focus more on the business of extraction and processing and producing end consumer products to the point where they can remain and be viably competitive in that space. Because it is becoming competitive, right? The cost per gram of oil is dropping everywhere because of consolidation, competition, saturation, and supply, right? This is a simple supply and demand problem in the market. And when we talk about our products in that space, we really kind of are starting to focus more so on explaining the value proposition in terms of efficiencies and product qualities that they offer customers, because that's really where you're gonna find the value, right? I think that goes for pretty much all of us now when you look at like an automated extraction system or an automated filling system, because those efficiencies matter, right?
Do you think that's the case in all markets? Like we have, 40 something separate markets in the US. Do you think in the new markets that's the case too? Like, seems like margins maybe aren't squeezed as much in those new markets.
The margins are definitely not as squeezed in new markets, but I think that because there's already a lot of established markets where the squeeze has come, there's a lot of cross-pollination of people from California and Colorado and Oregon going to new markets and helping people get set up. I think the new markets are still more familiar with the fact that, it's going to be a business and you're not just going from, your garage, growing weed for your buddies anymore. And you have to pay attention to what's happening instead of just like, this is the way that I've always done things, so I'm just gonna scale that.
So maybe it just moves faster from like people from new businesses and new markets just being able to make money with anything they do, basically, because prices are so high, everyone just wants to buy weed at no matter what the price is. Maybe it moves faster from that to like prices dropping and stabilizing because all the knowledge comes from other states quickly, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I think a really good example of that fast movement is the state of Oklahoma, right? Like that's a market where everybody thought for a minute that it was gonna blow up and be huge, and it got really saturated really quick. They were giving out licenses to everybody. Everybody was processing. You saw the gram of oil go from, I don't know what the prices were, but they really dropped fast, right? But also at the same time, the market really quickly recognized that the quality of that oil went from, look, I just want distillate to all of a sudden I want high quality dabs or vape carts, right?
The thing that was really interesting about Oklahoma is that the quality increase in the distillate went up really, really fast because they have a lot of oil refineries there and it's the same equipment. So that was one thing that I was taken aback by, was like, wow, your distillate is testing at 96%. Like,
I had real scientists working on it.
But that comes with other problems because if you're used to working with low quality distillate and trying to get that into a vape cartridge, when you suddenly have that step of like 90+% pure distillate, it completely changes the way that you fill that into a cartridge.
How does it change?
The viscosity goes up pretty steeply once you get above 90% pure. So you need to either add more terpenes or more heat to get the same throughput.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does the viscosity matter once it's in the cart?
Oh yeah, it definitely does. There's also so like legacy viewpoint, I guess, would be that more terps is better. more flavorful, which is true to a degree. But when you're processing your extract and putting it into a cartridge, that's not always the case, because there's variability between different cartridge manufacturers. And so some of them are going to taste really harsh if you've got a lot of terpenes in there. And then the other risk is it's going to make a leaky cartridge because it's not going to be as thermally stable. So it could either leak at the time that it's being filled, or it could leak before the customer gets it, or shortly after they start using it.
Yeah.
Keep it in their pocket for too long. So.
Well, and terpenes are just caustic, so the more you put in, the harsher it's going to be.
Yeah, and expensive. And so going back to the business aspect of having these conversations with customers, I get a lot of feedback of like, oh, we want to do like 15-20% terpenes in this oil. And I'm like, okay, well, you can try that. There's definitely cartridges that are designed to handle that, and some people have good effects with that, but if you bring it down to 5%, you can make 4 times as many cartridges. So
and probably a pretty similar quality at the end of the day.
Exactly. The user experience is not going to be like worlds different.
Right.
With much more than 5% terpenes. It's still going to taste awesome. It's still going to have the effect that the customer is looking for. And it's going to be able to be enjoyed until the last drop, because it's not going to be as likely to leak. So
it seems like at that point it's less dependent on just the amount of terpenes, but more the quality or which terpenes you have in there, like what the profile is that you're putting into the cart.
Yeah, of course, the constituency is still important, and the provenance, I guess, of the terpenes. If they're botanical or cannabis derived. The quality of the terpenes is going to have more of an impact than the quantity of whatever terpenes you're choosing.
Do you see a big difference in filling for cannabis-derived terpenes versus other botanically derived terpenes?
Yeah, botanically derived terpenes are incredibly forgiving when it's being mixed with distillate and trying to be put into a cartridge. You can heat them up a lot, and they'll run pretty much the same batch to batch. So there's a lot less process variability using botanical terpenes, because they're essentially pure isolates of terpenes. So the total mixture is very simple. It's just 90% pure THC, and however much terpenes you want to put in it. It's not going to have any surprises about it when you go to fill it. But yeah, cannabis derived, is usually just starts with a BHO extract, and people crash the crystals out, and then you have the sauce layer, which is maybe 50% terpenes. And so it tastes awesome because it's got all of the other flavor components in there that aren't terpenes. But because it's a more complicated mixture of stuff, it has a tendency to, not behave the same as something that's more isolated.
But then the other side of it is that there's the ingredient creation, production, and then formulation. But then the other side is, I see it more of the craft side, where you're just trying to get exactly what the plant was at the beginning, which you can do through formulation,
right?
And which is what a lot of people do already with the rudimentary formulation we do. But also, it's just nice to take exactly what was in the plant and put it into your extract. It's a lot harder with vape because of decarb, but on the dabbable side, it's way easier.
Yeah, a dabbable product is a lot more straightforward.
Yeah. But that's not saying you can't get a perfect strain specific product in vape.
No.
It's just a different process to get there.
Yeah, because it's not that much different. It's just a couple extra steps, going from making a jar with crystals in it and sauce. The only step you have to go to get it from that into a cartridge is separate those, decarb the crystals, mix in a known portion of sauce, not just all of it that came off the crystals. And doing it that way, you're not always going to have, you'll sometimes have leftover sauce from that extract, which if you're focused on making vapes, you can totally add to distillate, and it'll taste almost as good as the fully live resin product. But you can sell it at a different price point to attract different customers, and have different SKUs for different pocketbooks. So there's a lot more control of being able to look at your individual market and say, well, what sells? What are people buying? Do they want a fully botanical distillate cartridge? Of course, because some people want to just go in and put down $20 and leave with a cartridge.
Right.
But, you know, that opens the opportunity then for, you know, people to naturally, I think there's a tendency for people to, once they get exposed to something, they start looking for more craft.
Yeah. The market seems to
products.
always move upwards, right, in terms of quality, especially in nascent markets.
Indeed, yeah. And so as the market develops, you know, distillate cartridges, super easy to make, super cheap.
Right.
They sell, they get people exposed to the product, and then you can offer them, the next step up of quality, flavor, experience, and start to have more conversations about like, well, this is, you know, from our farm, not industrially sourced.
Yeah, in new markets, I think a lot of that's just about like knowledge, experience, and skill level of people in the marketplace. And so I think like you can have, in a new market, you always have, on the BHO side, you always have experienced cannabis people who've just been doing cannabis in that market for a long time. They know how to make a really high quality product, but they've been doing it at really low scale. So those products already always exist in new markets. They're just usually a really high price point. Then consumer preference starts to shift toward those higher quality products. And then the technology starts coming into that marketplace, like our extractor or your equipment.
Yep.
And it just makes it easier to produce those high quality products at a lower price point. So then they just gain popularity.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I definitely see that happening with many of the labs that we talk to. They get to a certain inflection point where they've realized, okay, we've gone from craft and now we need to scale that craft, right? And that's when the tools come into play. That's when the products come into play. And that's, I think that's where what you guys are doing is actually really interesting, right? From that automation perspective, and then also that filling perspective. Being able to like follow that craft precisely every single time and then scale it. Yeah,
I definitely get a lot more customers coming to me, you know, saying, hey, we're gonna fill live resin for the first time. How do we do that? And, you know, I have a consultation with them and outline, you know, the upstream processes that you're gonna need to have in place to be able to take that product from the craft scale to, you know, the more industrial scale, but keeping the quality at what you were doing earlier in the R&D phase of releasing those products. And so a lot of customers are really receptive to that because it is a lot different than making a distillate botanically flavored cartridge, because you have to be really on top of the grow and the extract and the post-processing to make sure that you're not inadvertently wasting your time at any one of those steps and causing quality to go down by, you know, not having the the full picture in view about how your process choices impact the cartridge that ends up on the shelf at the end of the day.
Right.
Yeah. Well, so much of that just goes back into consistency, like through the entire supply chain or the entire manufacturing process.
Yeah.
Like consistency in growing, making sure the strain is pretty stable and you're growing it the same way every year. Then how you're extracting, so you make sure you have the same terpene profile and same components going through your extraction, and then going into whatever post-processing you're doing.
Yeah, and the post-processing is where there's a lot of opportunities to make up for some of those variabilities that you encounter during the growing and the extraction process. Obviously, the more you can control those, the better time you're gonna have when it comes to post-processing those extracts. Yeah, when you get into post-processing, there's a lot of tricks you can play to still end at a vape cartridge that is consistent from batch to batch and year to year. And that's mostly decarboxylation and formulation of your terpenes from the extraction process.
So what do you think about formulation versus just extracting a single product and carrying that one product all the way through whatever cleanup you're doing on it to a finished retail product?
If you're starting with the live resin product, it's going to have retained most of the terpenes from the growing process. And so naturally you want to try to preserve those terpenes until they get into the cartridge. I use the term bulk extract with my customers. Because there's a tendency to want to just take your bulk extract, decarb it, and put it into a cartridge.
Sure.
Certainly works. But that process is going to lose a lot of the terpenes because you haven't removed them from the decarb process, which is pretty violent. You have a lot of heat and a lot of gases, and so the CO2 is going to strip the terpenes out of the oil. And if you're doing that at atmospheric pressure, in a normal atmosphere, it's going to be oxidizing the oil and the terpenes as well with the oxygen from the atmosphere. And so by the time it gets into a cartridge, it'll taste something like the weed originally did, but you don't know how much terpenes you lost during that process. And so you're not really sure what temperatures you should be using when it comes time to fill it.
Right.
And so you waste a lot of time, like with having introduced a lot more variability, trying to figure out where you need to be to hit, 10,000 cartridges this week or whatever the goal is.
Yeah, for carts it seems much more, where you have to decarb, it seems much more just beneficial to separate first, then just remix. I think it's weird that we're in this funny formulation point in the industry where most other industries, you're isolating compounds. So we'd isolate THC, CBD, whatever, all the other cannabinoids. Then we'd isolate all the different terpenes. Then we'd have, 200 ingredients to play with and put together whatever end product we want. But we're nowhere close to that yet. So we do this half separation where we just take out our sauce, the high terpene, low cannabinoid oil, and then we have our terpenes, and then we just kind of mush them back together. Yeah. It's it's better. It's a better process, especially for vape cart production. Yeah. But it's still, I think it's just way behind where we need to be.
Yeah, it's nothing like more industrialized, established industry for sure. Because best case scenario, you would have a bunch of HPLCs that you would put your extract into, and then you would have all of your starting materials, and you have complete control over the formulation. And I'm certain that will come at some point. But at this point, it's a lot easier to rely on more mechanical processes instead of chemical processes to get that control. So, mechanical process being the physical act of THCA crystallizing on its own, and then separating that from everything that doesn't crystallize. So the control then is a little bit more simple. You don't need very complex equipment to accomplish that.
But then our crystallization techniques are just so rudimentary right now, so our yield for the crystallized THC is just so low.
Yeah, it's either low or lengthy.
Right.
Or you want to do recrystallizations and other solvents, and that's not always legal depending on the market. So
I think that's also another thing to talk about, especially from my perspective, my lens of my industry, right? There's a lot of misinformation out there, right? There's a lot of people that are not processing correctly, or are maybe over-processing in some way, or overutilizing or underutilizing some mechanism in the process, especially when it comes to filter media, right? Like in the early days of CRC, people would just say, throw some silica in a CRC column, nuke the product as it's coming out, and then you end up with limonene and pinene terpenes, and that's it. And guess what? That then translates into the future of people thinking all BHO extracted CRC product is garbage, ergo BHO is bad, ergo vape carts are bad, and it's just this vicious cycle of misinformation where really it was just not understanding a process early on instead of taking a closer look at how things should be done, especially in a lab environment, right?
I like the way you put that, just a vortex of overshooting or undershooting, or any part of the process, because it's all important, and then it all filters back once it gets into the customer's hands. because word travels fast, and you know,
well, like we're talking about, like any one of our products, they're all at different points in the production process. Like if you have a mistake, if you over-process, under-process at any point, it'll affect all of our processes, right?
Yeah.
Right. It's kind of like, I always like to try to, like, when I talk to, you know, customers, and I try to really reinforce the fact that we are doing selective extraction, right? We're being very selective about what we're extracting, whether it's terpenes or whether it's just the THC, in that, you know, you're very selectively choosing a narrow band of items that you're trying to extract out of a biomass that really has an incredibly wide array of compounds in it, right? And those compounds can be just the biomass itself, and or on the contaminant side, you know, the pesticides, the heavy metals, those kinds of things, you know? And what happens when you then concentrate them and they end up in a cart, right? And that's something that we pay close attention to. So I think it's important for all of us, maybe, I don't want to call us industry leaders, but definitely like minds in the industry to pay attention to what's happening from that upstream and downstream process, and then help provide the cleanest, safest possible product in that space. And kind of like focus that conversation there, because eventually what happens is I think, and the hope is that noise, that misinformation starts to die off, because they don't have valid points to make. They're not making valid arguments. They're not backed by anything.
Yeah, data speaks volumes. And I think that's something that people are becoming more and more cognizant about. Like
Slowly
but surely.
Slowly,
VapeJet from day one has had a reporting feature.
Oh, okay.
So it tracks all the cartridges that it ever fills. So you know the temperature, the time, how long it took. There's a picture of it. You could take 2 pictures of it even. Not until this year did people ask, hey, how do I actually use these reports and get this data to track my production and know when there's something going wrong? And I'm like, oh, awesome.
Finally.
This is how you download the report. This is how you convert it into a usable format and have fun.
We had the exact same experience. Like we data log everything. Probably like, I don't know, 30 parameters once every 5 seconds.
Yeah.
We're creating huge data logs. No one ever used them. I think, and it's the same thing, maybe in the last 18, 24 months is when people actually have started to come back and say, hey, either we want this data to improve our process, or we need this data for compliance.
Yeah. And we saw that in CRC in Canada immediately, right? They always wanted the COAs. They always wanted to make sure that it was food grade, FDA grade, NSF certified. And what we did was, we don't have, obviously, it's a consumable product, so we don't have a PLC or some sort of metrics like that we can log every run. That's not our business. Our media, though, what we try to make sure, and we don't even really report this as much, and we don't even really market it, but we test all of our products, not just through examination of the product itself, but we run biomass through that product. So we actually run it in some sort of cannabinoid product to make sure that those co-solvents in there, such as the terpenes, right? Such as the THC or CBD or whatever is being processed, that those are also analyzed, because we want to find out not just like, hey, what's being extracted from the oil, but is there anything getting into that oil, right? And it's data that we provide on every single batch of product that we manufacture and provide to the consumer. They just have to ask. Well, guess who's asking? Everybody that has tight regulations, such as Canada.
Right.
But in the US, maybe 1 or 2 people this year alone have asked for that information, but not en masse, right?
Yeah, there's like a tendency, like in nascent markets, you know, they understand the need for testing because there's a regime that dictates that you must test all of your products, but it doesn't dictate that you must test your products in process to know how it's performing and whether or not you're going to end up with something that's sellable at the end. So running your, getting the actual data of how the media works and being able to provide that, I think, is a valuable piece of the pie there, because that's a conversation that I have with my customers a lot, is like, well, you're doing live resin, do you have COA on it? And they're like, maybe, like we have COA on the bulk extract as it came out of the extraction process. And I was like, okay, well, and then how did you formulate it? And did you get test results after that so that you know how much terpenes were retained? And they're like, well, no, I don't have that.
We talked about this a little bit earlier at some point, but dispelling the myths of CRC is really just providing good data on the products, right? We can go over the qualitative side of CRC applications, where we can talk about the color remediation side of it, right? That is color remediation, CRC, color remediation column. And we can also talk about some of the other things that CRC does, which is moving the impurities. But in the end of the day, CRC really comes down to filtration, which has been around for a really, really long time, right? I mean, we've been filtering everything from wine to fruit juices to olive oils. And for some reason, at some point, somebody said, oh, okay, because we're in cannabis and we now have this CRC nomenclature, this obviously sounds super scary, it must be dangerous, and as a consequence, CRC is bad, right? And you see a lot of processors trying to shy away from CRC for a number of reasons, one of which is that that sort of misplaced, abject hate for CRC in a lot of cases, where people just are vitriolically
some animosity.
They're incredibly upset. They're like, you're destroying Mother Nature. And I'm like, what are you talking about, right? Like, we're not destroying anything. If anything, we're trying to help make products safer and better to use. And at the very least, even on the qualitative side of things, we're making them better for the consumer from just the pure appeal of it, right? Like, we're trying to make sure that these products look good in the cart, as they end up on the shelf.
What are the specifics of the complaint that people have? The biggest complaint that people have with CRC?
If I was gonna be allowed to say it, it's basically just fuck CRC. Genuinely speaking.
But why?
They don't understand. The majority of the time,
it's
when
just prejudice.
It is literally a prejudice. It is just this concept of like, hey, CRC is bad because you're adding something or you're altering the oil, right? You're adding something to it or you're altering the oil. You're faking. Basically, like, you're taking bunk or crappy weed, right?
Yeah, but that argument is completely. You're changing something. It's like it's already been changed by the fact that it is no longer a flower. You've taken it and turned it into oil.
Right. So the myth really comes back to this sort of lack of information, or the low information person out there that has either jumped on a bandwagon of myth or some sort of like whatever the latest trend is on Instagram, right? But to be fair, right, to every single myth that is out there is a grain of truth, right? And the grain of truth, I think, at least if we're going to be fair, let's say we're going to be generous to these guys and say, like, why do you hate CRC, right? If you're going to be sort of compassionate, be like, well, let me understand your point of view. Where was the genesis? Where did it start? And I do think it started in the very, very beginning of some of these sort of, like, we'll call them, low information operators, extracting oil and trying to figure out a way to make good looking oil out of arguably oxidized biomass, and then throwing whatever they thought they could into that CRC column to make that oil. And in the process of doing that, they overprocessed the biomass. They threw in compounds that they didn't really have a full understanding of, like silica, for example. Silica is a great remediator. It's an incredibly polar compound. It has the ability to extract and pull a lot of compounds into itself, right? And then let the resulting THC out. And what happens as a consequence is you get a THC product that only has one specific type of flavor profile. So in the early days of, let's say, carts or dabs, everything sort of had a limonene or pinene taste to it. That's because all of the lighter volatiles were stripped out, right? All of those, like, really nice aromatics from the high quality weed that existed are no longer present. And in people's mind, they just equated that as being somehow bad. Like, no one wanted a dab or a cart that just tasted like pine sol. They wanted something of higher quality. So then other processors came along and said, well, here's a live resin cart, or here's a fresh frozen cart. And it did offer those products. And they said, well, this didn't use CRC, or maybe it did and they don't know, right? Or it was done correctly. But then the people that were overtly using poor CRC methodologies, they got kind of thrown under the bus or somehow negatively impacted. And that happened early on, right?
A new technology or a new technique always has some learning curve that it needs to go through.
Yeah.
At the core of it, it's just it is just tribal, and because filtration, CRC is just another filtration process.
Right.
It's just we use something else to filter it.
That's
we
right.
use an absorbent media instead of filter paper or stainless steel mesh or whatever it is.
Right.
And so no matter what, everyone in BHO extraction or all types of cannabis extraction, they're filtering the product at some point. It's just where they filter it and how they filter it.
Yep.
And CRC is just another method to do the same thing.
Yeah, kind of going back to that irrational exuberance again, like, I love that, because how do you present good data in an environment where memes are the means to transmit that data?
Yeah.
Right? Like, the quality of the information is going to precipitously go down if the only way to send a message is through a meme, right? How do I show you, like, no, you can't take bad biomass and make it better, right?
Yeah.
You can't take, you can certainly take good biomass and make it worse.
Oh yeah, it's
Like,
very easy.
That's easy to do. And like you said also earlier, you've already fundamentally changed the biomass by extracting it and creating an oil out of it, right?
Yeah, so what's one more thing?
Right,
You know, really, if it's gonna end up, if you're gonna add something to the process that's gonna make a better end product, that should, the focus should always be, on the qualitative aspect of the product. Does it look good? Is it what people want? But the flip side of any qualitative assessment is a quantitative assessment of looking at the numbers.
That's right.
That match. Does it look good? Well,
Right.
What are the numbers that make sure that it looks good?
Right. And that's why I really like Jack's analogy of saying, like, hey, you're already filtering, whether it's with a filter paper or a sintered disc, right? These are physical filtration methodologies, right? And physiomechanical, or I should say, chemistry-based extraction methodologies are really just the exact same thing. If you're taking a polar molecule, let's say it's a carotenoid, right, or phenolic resin or something like that, or even a chlorophyll molecule, right? Instead of saying, well, here's a physical barrier, here's now this sort of like semi-electric slash magnetic particle that it then bonds to, right? That polar charge that we're looking at. And you're just saying, like, now on a molecular level, I'm filtering out this specific thing that I don't want to end up in my oil, right? So that filter analogy really is true from that sense, where it is really just a selective process of pulling the things that we don't want from in our resulting oil, right? We don't want a cloudy cart. We don't want heavy metals on the bad side of things. We don't want pesticides on an even worse level of things. How do we make sure that the resulting oil is actually a true expression of that biomass? Because that is the goal, right? We want that fresh frozen biomass. We want that cured run. We want that nug run to be in the cart the truest expression of that form. And the only way you can do that is if you start selectively pulling out the things that you don't want. You're pulling back the weeds in a way and saying, like, no, that's the essence of what I'm looking for, and that's the special thing that makes our biomass, our product, special, right? And if you zoom out to 60,000 feet, if you're a business, right, and you're looking at a way to make yourself stand out in a crowd of hundreds of processors, hundreds of brands, and now some people are even going interstate, right, where this market is exponentially expanding, how do you stand out, right? And it's gonna come down to your biomass and your ability to express that biomass in its best way possible, right? And that's what we try to do. Our company is trying to really give you the tools to do just that, filtering out the noise, filtering out the weeds, and getting at that truest expression. and doing it in an efficient manner, doing it quickly and doing it safely, that's a win.
Yeah.
Huge myths around data. Like data, half the myths that around BHO that we deal with on a regular basis are just because the data doesn't exist in the industry and no one's collecting it. Like there's a really big myth about extraction temperatures. What temperature you need to extract at in order to achieve a certain quality. Again, it goes back to filtration on extraction temperature. But basically, most of the industry, they're measuring their temperature really indirectly. We use process chillers to cool the extraction process, and we know the temperature, we as an industry know the temperature of the process chiller. That's just sending cold fluid to the extractor. That's transferring heat from a metal, from the solvent, and then from the biomass. So there's like a number of steps where the temperature can change way before it goes back to the chiller where you're measuring it. So you're collecting data really indirectly. Collecting data by looking at the chiller every once in a while, saying, okay, I'm extracting at -80. My chiller set temp is -80. Really, that's not the case at all, because there's a ton of heat gain, energy transfer between your actual extraction and your chiller. So a lot of what we talk about with customers when they first get our extractor, everyone wants to extract at -120. Technically, our chillers will go down to -120 Fahrenheit. But the problem is, at -120, your yield drops dramatically, and there's really no increase in product quality. Like there's a threshold where you stop increasing product quality, or product quality increases very, very slowly above it, but yield just tanks. But everyone thinks that nope, quality just keeps going up and yield remains the same. And that's because they've been extracting with a -80 chiller and they thought their actual extraction was -80. They just never measured their actual extraction. So they're maybe extracting at -30, -40, -50.
Which is just fine.
Right, yeah. You make a really high quality product. Yeah, and maybe your product quality does go up a little bit, but it's just a tiny amount.
Yeah, it's not worth it for
marginal
the
returns,
Yeah, it's not worth it for the hit that you take to the overall yield.
Yield, process time goes down when things are cold. Things just don't like, fluids don't like to move around as much.
Yeah, it takes longer and you end up with less at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And you can see how it gets there, because if you don't have the insight into what was actually happening before you stepped into a completely new regime of, trying to automate it. Yeah, if you go in with having done a manual process before and switching to an automated process, the things that were working in the manual process are not necessarily going to translate into an automated process.
Yeah.
And you may actually shoot yourself in the foot.
Right, exactly, yeah. And all these many extractors, there's 10 years of tribal knowledge in the industry that says we extract at -80 or we extract at -100. And it's just hard to, I guess, re-educate about that. But that's where the data analysis actually comes in. That's where collecting data and then analyzing it later comes into play. Because you can see, okay, I made the product quality that I was looking for and I did it at -40 or -45, whatever it is. So yeah, that's been it's a huge hurdle for us all the time in so many areas.
Yeah, the temperature thing comes into play. It's a conversation I have a lot with my customers as well, and they're sort of a similar and different way that they approach that. So they have their extraction process down, they have their grow process down, and so they have this really high quality oil, and they're like, okay, I want to fill this at 35C into a cartridge, and I'm like, that is maybe physically impossible. If you could do it, it's gonna be 10 times slower than if you just give it a little bit more heat, and then having that conversation about the heater set point is not the process temperature.
Right.
There's always a temperature gradient, especially in our system for filling vapes, because one of the heaters is an air heater. So the temperature that's measured is the temperature of air, which is a pretty terrible conductor of heat, and then it's got to transfer from air that's moving through PTFE and then into the oil. So the oil is always going to be colder than your heater set points. And it might be 5 degrees colder, you know? And having those conversations about thermodynamics with people is trying to figure out a way to wrap that in a way that is easily understood without having to have a whole college course about it. It's pretty challenging at times. But ultimately, I think people do sort of see like, okay, well, you know, I'll just try it. I'll just try running this at like 70 C and then see what it tastes like. And then it becomes a qualitative assessment again of, is this something that I can put my stamp of approval for quality behind?
Right.
And then the link gets made back to the quantitative side of, okay, well, I was doing it at this number and it still came out good, so this is the way.
Yeah.
Manual process versus automation.
Yeah.
You guys are both essentially able to do both. You can both run both your systems manually, but what you really do both well is automate that process. And that's a world I used to come from, like professionally, right? And then I got into this industry and I was like, wow, look at these opportunities. Right? So then I see like these guys, like I'll see a Luna and I'll be like, wow. Even from an automation perspective, that is really cool, right? Because you not only do you get the data, but you get that efficiency, right? I'm a big proponent, like I've always talked about, like what does the business of cannabis look like? Where do those efficiencies come from? Well, there's only one answer in the future, right? And that is good data and good automation. And both VapeJet and Luna do that well.
Yeah, I think for Luna, it's, again, automation, it's our biggest benefit to the customer. But also, it's sometimes a challenging conversation to have with people because there's this myth in the industry that you can't make a high quality craft product with automation.
Yeah.
You need someone who knows extraction well, who knows the biomass well in order to make a good quality product. But then when you talk to people about this, you get down into the weeds and it just doesn't really make sense. I mean, all the person is doing is exactly what the automation is doing. The person is looking at the process, observing what's happening, usually through indirect methods that aren't necessarily good, and then making decisions on which valve to open.
Right.
That's about it.
And the error rates start going up, right? Because the human factor is
Right, yeah. So it's really good to have, you need someone who knows cannabis to build whatever your extraction process is, right? They need to figure out how to optimize a recipe for a specific strain. But once they do, at that point, all they're doing is what our automation does. They're trying to do the same exact thing every run after run,
Right.
except they're trying to look at 4 different pressures and 6 different temperatures, and you just can't balance all that. So that's when the errors come up, where automation, we're measuring all that 100 or more times a second, and we can make those decisions, the same decisions, a lot faster.
Right.
So all we're really doing is building people's decision trees into computer logic,
Right.
and then having it follow through on that.
Yeah, you're really not taking anything away from the craft extractor. You're just saying, hey, let me just allow you to make this repeatable, right?
Right, yeah, exactly. And once you can convince people of that, which is sometimes challenging, as soon as they get it, which happens every single time, as soon as they get it, then they start having fun. Then they realize, okay, I can play around with this process. The only difference is I'm not running around and turning valves on my own. I'm just playing around with it on a recipe or on the computer screen.
Right.
And then at the end of the day, they can just leave.
Yeah.
They can just walk away and their process is running then on its own.
Right. And that process allows you to get like an extra run or 2 in a day, right?
For sure, yeah. It just cuts out all the inefficiencies of, it took me 20 seconds longer to walk over there, turn a valve. But then really the benefit is just consistency. In the same product every single time. Yeah. Which lets you scale. Lets you scale your business. If you're one guy who has to be on the machine all the time, you can't make more product unless you sleep less.
Yeah, or hire more people.
Right.
And run second shifts and third shifts. And yeah, I think that's what I really like about automating the extraction process, because it still does give people agency to have creativity about the process and to leverage their knowledge to create a high quality extract. And it just makes, the execution a lot easier because you can do it repeatably. when it comes time to do talking about automating vapes, that's another area where there's some resistance, but whereas I can understand a lot easier the resistance from the extraction side, because it does take skill. There is a level of art to it. Yeah. But when it comes to putting oil in a cartridge, that is not a skilled process at all. And it's, very, very mind numbing and also very physically numbing and damaging, and it's not fun for anyone. No one is going around being, very, proud of their accomplishments, I guess, if they've filled by hand, 10,000 cartridges or whatever.
Well, that's a good point too, that there's a safety aspect to it.
100%.
If you're doing repeatable processes, it has an effect on your body. And so automation helps that.
Yeah, it helps retain your best workers, because they're not going to be burnt out because they're doing this motion all day, every day for 8 hours a day. And implementing automation and filling really allows you to, have not only be able to retain your people better, but to use them for what people are good at.
Right. Yeah.
Where people can have agency and creativity in their role and feel fulfilled, that they're contributing to, the organization in a way that's valued and allows them to have agency about what it is they're doing, so you don't have a room full of people just doing this all day. You can have those people doing other things if their only involvement in filling cartridges is putting a new tray in the machine and clicking a button.
They can be running extraction.
They can be monitoring the extraction. They can be, packing columns, getting ready for the next run. Right. They can be doing, packaging. Anywhere else in the process from start to finish of, your business, you can take people out of doing the boring work, the, repetitive work, the dangerous work, and reallocate them to where it's going to provide a lot more value to them as a person, but also the organization as a whole.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of our customers who they had, say, 2 or 3 extractors running their equipment full time on the equipment, and then we come in, replace that equipment with ours that's automated. Now that person, those operators are out of the hazardous area, because we do volatile extraction. No matter how safe it is, it's better to be outside of that area.
Yeah, it's literally called a volatile area, right?
So we get them out of there, and then what they do is they go and run post-processing. Lots of people running vape jets who are the extractor also, because they have the time to do that.
Yeah, you really get to leverage human capital by implementing automation, and those leverages, also happen on the cost side. Paying someone to hand fill a cartridge is, depending on how much you're paying them, like 10 or 15 cents maybe per cartridge. It's not cheap, But if the touch points involved in that process go from 200 or 300 per tray down to 5 or 6, the savings are an order of magnitude or more. And it really compounds.
I've been in so many labs where there's just rooms full of people filling carts.
Yep.
It just seems like such low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, it's a bit preposterous at times. The manual labor, it costs a lot for a reason, and usually it's because there isn't much process control, so you got to pay someone to be the quality control agent for every single cartridge that goes through into packaging at every single step, so if you're not controlling your extraction process, and you're not doing color remediation, and you're not doing, separating your crystals from your sauce before you decarb it and put it into a cartridge, if you're not controlling any of those things, you need a person there to make sure that each cartridge looks okay. If you have processes that are controlled, you can rely on them to just happen, because you've got a recipe developed. And it does the same thing every single time. If you do things the same way every single time, it becomes predictable. And then once you have something that's predictable, automation is gonna allow things to explode in a good way, not in a dangerous way. Yeah, once you have control over your processes, the ability to leverage automation goes up a lot.
We see that too on our end of the business, like rooms full of people filling vape carts manually, right? People have dedicated rooms to filling CRC columns, right? And we have our products here which show up at the front door and say like, hey, you don't need people packing CRC columns with different layers. We've simplified that process for the same reasons as safety as well, right? Nothing of ours aerosolizes and becomes hazardous to the workers in that environment. We were the company that innovated that granular media for that reason, right? Not only do the people filling those CRC columns suddenly have what used to be a 30, 45 minute job filling a couple columns, so now it's like, oh, I can just fill it in 30 seconds and I'm done. I can walk away and do something else.
Yeah, you don't
and
have,
it's safer.
Yeah, right? You don't have to don a bunch of PPE. And,
I've seen people in bunny suits, right, in those rooms and respirators. I'm like, what are you guys doing? This is wild. Get out of there. That's another thing too, like, the qualitative and quantitative aspects of working in a craft business, working with volatiles is, that automation, that simplicity of the process. I think it's actually really kind of a clutch thing to pay attention to.
Yeah.
So we talked about myths around VHO and CRC and just how we have to deal with those. What are the myths around vape filling?
Yeah. There's no such thing as the artisanally filled vape cart.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist.
Yeah, the oil is artisanal. The filling should not be. That should be not a boutique situation, of handcrafted filled vape cartridge. Like it's not gonna convey the things that are imbued by, talking about how the other aspects are craft, like the extraction or the growing. Those are craft. And I think craft is sort of defined by the fact that it's multifaceted. You have to be good at a number of different things in order to have a craft brand of cannabis flower. You have to have a wide breadth of skills in order to have a craft brand of extracts. And those all feed into cartridges, but the filling of it is not a craft. It's a skill or a task at best. It's not something where you can, express yourself. But one of the hiccups that comes there, in addition to maybe too much terpenes or not knowing how much terpenes are in the oil, some customers are aware that they should be separating their diamonds, decarbing them separate from the sauce, and then mixing them back together to get into the cartridge. And some of them are even aware that, I maybe don't want to put all of my sauce back in with my liquid diamonds. I want to have control over that process. But there's still opportunity for some headaches if you're doing the homogenization, the mixing of those two things together in a suboptimal way, because it goes back to your assertion, the myths and problems are from either doing something too much or doing something not enough. And so mixing and homogenizing is something that I didn't expect to be quite such a sticking point for so many operators. But I've had a lot of conversations trying to figure out problems with bubbly cartridges, because bubbles can also happen from the homogenization process. Totally separate from how much terpenes are in there is just how you got them into the oil. And one of the things that I found is that there's a very common piece of equipment that I've seen in a lot of labs is a hot plate with a magnetic stir bar.
Definitely in every single lab.
Definitely in every single lab. They do serve a purpose, and after working on problems with bubbly cartridges or oxidized cartridges with customers, the culprit has almost always been a magnetic stir plate with heating only from the bottom. And what happens is that the bottom of whatever jar you have on there gets superheated, and the stir bar won't spin because it's magnetically coupled and it doesn't have torque. And so, they just put it on there until it gets warm enough for the stir bar to start stirring, and then it eventually heats the top part of the oil, and then they just crank it up to speed up the mixing, which is all rational, right? It's got to be warm for this thing to work, so let's get it warm, and then the faster it's spinning, the faster it's going to mix. That all is true. But if it's spinning a vortex in the oil, it's incorporating a lot of air. And if you've got the oil superheated because it needs to be super low viscosity for the magnetic stir bar to work, it's going to increase the rate of oxidation of the oil and the terpenes. And the terpenes that you put in there are going to come right back out. Some of them will stay in the oil. A lot of them will end up in the room, making the most expensive air freshener ever. And then when you're done mixing that oil and you put it into the vape jet to fill, the air that's been absorbed by the oil is going to want to come out.
Yeah.
And so then you can get champagne looking cartridges again. And even if that doesn't happen, if you've been sitting it on a hot plate for 4 hours, overheating it, the oxidation rate is going to have increased so much that by the time it ends up in the cartridge, it's going to turn red by the time it gets onto the shelf. No one's going to want to buy it.
Yeah.
May even start to turn red immediately. I've heard, people, after a day or two, it's starting to turn red, and I'm like, okay, well, how are you mixing it? And they tell me this, and I'm like, yeah, that's maybe not the best way to do that.
Exposing as much surface area to oxygen as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's like the median case of like the worst things that can happen with homogenizing something wrong. So some people are, again, cognizant, okay, I don't want to be superheating my oil. I don't want to be whipping a bunch of air into it. I want to get the overall process done as fast as possible and as cold as possible. What equipment can I deploy to do that? And a lot of people settle on something that's used in the cosmetic industry for making lotions, which is called a high shear rotor stator mixer.
Yep.
It'll do that. You can mix at room temperature. You can incorporate stuff very quickly. And I've had one example of the rotor stator homogenizer not being of a very high quality itself, and it was contributing to heavy metals.
Yeah, the shear head.
Yep, that didn't get discovered until the oil had already ended up in the cartridge.
Yeah.
And
it's not a perfect system either, right? Because the shear head itself, as it mechanically moves through the oil, generates its own heat, right?
yeah, it does. Yeah, it's cavitation,
Right.
microcavitation, which gets to, I think, millions of degrees temporarily.
Yeah.
So you still have the possibility for superheating locally, at least the oil, and increasing the rate at which it's going to degrade. It's going to be less shelf stable. And so all of those process implementations and on the surface appear to be in line with the, we're doing this the right way, we're doing this, in an optimized way. But when it comes to homogenization, the best way that I've found, the lowest risk, is to just do it by hand. Just mix it nice and slow with the silicone scraper, 5 minutes, and you're good to go.
So what's kind of a key takeaway that you would take from not just this conversation, but sort of like how you present yourself to the market?
Key takeaway about Vape Jet in the market of filling vape cartridges, I would think, is that it's all about data and control. It gives you an unprecedented insight into the process of filling cartridges. So even though it's not something that I would call craft, having the ability to see what's happening in there is still going to give you an idea of what's happening and what needs to maybe change. And I think, being data driven in implementing that is, has wide benefits to all aspects of the cannabis business. And, I think that certainly there's some customers who, in their experience with VapeJet, have started to take those lessons of, measuring and, having a feedback loop of constantly assessing how things are being done. It's definitely benefited a lot of companies to be able to, leverage their brand and gain market share.
Right, Jack?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we talked about today is how lack of data, lack of knowledge in the industry has just led to a lot of inefficiencies, and then how that affects businesses in the current marketplace. Like business across the board is just down, it's slow right now, especially in cannabis. So as that happens, then it just starts to put more pressure on processors, who we all deal with. And as that happens, you have to start looking at margin a little closer. And what can you do to increase margins or maintain your margins in a tough market where prices are dropping? And I think all of our companies, all of our products help do that. They help our customers do that. And at Luna, we do that by putting in an automated solution for extraction, where you can reduce your operating costs by reducing labor, moving labor to more effective areas, like in pre-processing, and then also maintaining safety, and by creating a consistent product, which just helps you build your brand and scale your product. You can't scale your product without creating a consistent product. And without having, or because our biomass has the potential to be so inconsistent, you need consistency in product, or in processing, to make sure your end product comes out the same every time. And I think all three of our products help do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that at Media Bros, we really emphasize simplifying and demystifying that CRC process. We're really emphasizing the safety of it as well. Like, you can't clog one of our CRC columns because it's granular, right? And processing through a Luna, through our media, and then right into a VapeJet, that shortest distance from the biomass to the cart is really where we come into effect. Where if you're not thinking about CRC, we've done our job quite well, realistically, right? And the idea that we have to face the naysayers in our market, respectively, in all fronts, I think is really not something that we really need to worry about too much, because in the end, the data will provide those answers, right? Eventually, the market's going to realize, like, holy moly, I'm in a really competitive space. I need to create the best possible products, and they need to taste good, they need to look good, and they need to present well when they end up in that packaging, right? So I think that's the biggest takeaway for me right now in this discussion, which is that interesting sort of dynamic, how you have all of these components that actually need to work well together. Good process flow, right? Will save you.
Yeah.